Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilman is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 least played cards of the entire year for 2018. What that means is the cards on this list were played from hand onto the board less than any other cards throughout the calendar year from January 1st to December 31st. Now, do keep in mind that means that there is a little bit of a bias here against things like RastaCons Rumble. In other words, those cards have had less time to be played, so they're actually more likely to show up on this list or more likely to look bad on this list. But despite that, you might just be surprised. This list is not dominated by RastaCon or Boomsday cards that only maybe had a month or 6 months to actually make an impact. There's still going to be some classic cards and cards from other expansions featured here. Now, before I go on, of course, I want to note that this list and all the data in this video were provided by hsreplay.net, and this is exclusive data. You can't break down all the data on HS Replay by a year, but they were kind enough to send me this giant file to get all of these cards throughout the course of the year. That said, you can get up-to-date stats on hsreplay.net, of course, for things like how often cards are played or their deck inclusion rates. So if you're curious how things have fared maybe over the last 14 days, the last couple days, the latest patch, hsreplay.net will certainly be able to hook you up. All of that said, let's go ahead and jump into this list and see just which cards people didn't play in 2018. Up first at the number 10 spot here, we have Holomancer from the Boomsday Project, which was only played 11,000 times in HS Replay's dataset. Now, keep in mind, the most played cards were in the like 20, 30, 40 million range. So 11,000 to 40 million is an enormous distinction. And I bet some people out there right now are even going like, man, I totally forgot Holomancer was a card. I don't know if I've ever even seen that card. And that's going to be a common sentiment as we go throughout this list. But what's the problem with Holomancer, right? Why is this card not being played? Well, in reality, it just looks like a worse mirror entity in a lot of cases where you've got a 3/3 body attached to a mirror entity that doesn't give you the stats, it only gives you the effect, which makes this card very easy to play around, even easier than mirror entity. So it's an expensive, risky sort of thing that just no decks really need, and the meta certainly doesn't demand right now. So despite the what I think is kind of cool artwork and neat character, and certainly a different feel than most Hearthstone cards from an art standpoint, this guy's just not good enough to see play, and the data supports it. Moving on to the number 9 spot here, we have a classic card. And keep in mind, classic cards, they were there throughout the entire year. So any classic card or a card from the previous year's expansions like Unguro or Frozen Throne or Kobolds and Catacombs, any of those that show up on this list, that means people really, really hated them because they had a year to be played and no one was playing them despite that. You know, RastaCons cards only had a month to be played, so some of those on this list might not be quite as hated by the population as cards like Ravenholt Assassin, which clearly nobody is playing, coming in with less than 10,000 plays in HS Replay's dataset. And why is that? I don't actually know. I don't think this card is as fundamentally bad as some of the others we've seen on this list. If you're like a new player or a budget player, I could see a card like this being in the top end in an aggressive deck, just trying to get that guaranteed 7 damage. You know, it's got a big stat. It's like War Golem, but with some upside because of that stealth. So I don't actually hate this one as much, but the real reality is there's just no reason to play this card in standard format constructed Hearthstone, and the people running Hearthstone Deck Tracker, the people contributing to the HS Replay dataset, just don't want to run cards like this. There are much better alternatives at those sorts of costs. So this guy just kind of falls through the cracks. Maybe not fundamentally terrible, but just expensive, slow, no real reason to run this over alternatives, and that's why it's on the list. Moving on to the number 8 spot here, we have Toothy Chest from Kobolds and Catacombs, coming in with just over 9,000 plays. And the problem for Toothy Chest is that 0 attack minions just don't work very well in Hearthstone, because the upside of this card is getting a big statted minion, a 4/4, when it works. There are a lot of other scarier 3-drops competing with this thing. Think like Hinged Clan Thug, Vicious Fledgling, cards that don't have that downside of the delayed attack, but have even more upside where they can scale into bigger and scarier things. So there's just a real competition problem for Toothy Chest. And even if there weren't, this card just dies for free. A 2/2 or a 3/3 are almost always going to be better than a 0/4. We saw the same problem with cards like Validated Doomsayer in the past, When that attack is on a delay, it means your opponent gets all the time and initiative in the world to kill this thing for free, and that just makes it a really big problem without the upside necessary to overcome that downside or that risk, leaving it as one of the least played cards of the year. Up next here, we have our first RastaCons card, and I will admit, this one's a bit of a surprise to me. The Regenerating Thug coming in with only 8,664 plays, and that's way below lots and lots of other RastaCon cards. As you'll see, there aren't that many RastaCon cards on this list. Most of them were seeing some experimentation and play at the end of the year. So, they jumped above lots of other cards that were just forgotten and left by the wayside throughout the course of the year. I thought Regenerating Thug would be a card that saw more experimentation, that saw more play, because really, if you look at it, it's not that bad of a stat line. 3, 5 for 4, gets really close to the vanilla test, and you got this upside with restoring health to it, so maybe it can take some trades and hang around. There's heal synergy decks out there. I'm sort of shocked that this one is so low. I don't know why it's slipping past people's attentions, or deck experiments, or all those sorts of things. So I'm gonna have to test this one myself. I think I even saw like Crip playing this card recently, so a real shocker for me. But nonetheless, the data says Regenerating Thug is kind of being ignored and forgotten in the experimentation era of RastaCons Rumble, coming in, and I think the bottom 4 or 5 cards for the entire expansion. It looks better and more hopeful than that to me, so keep an eye on this one, but for now, still on the list. And then up next here, we have the Wicked Skeleton from Knights of the Frozen Throne with 7,000 or almost 7,500 plays, and it's a 4-mana 1/1. So it's not too surprising to me to see this guy on this list. Now, of course, it does have a battle cry that can gain it some stats, but it's really, really hard to do that in a sensible fashion compared to a card like, maybe Corridor Creeper, for instance, that gets a really big benefit when minions die. This one's much more conditional, harder to achieve. Even if you get 3 or 4 minions to die in that turn when you want, it kind of becomes like a vanilla statted minion. It never gets that big. I mean, even the best case scenario where you clear a ton of stuff with some miraculous defile, you're still just committing stats into a single body, which is very susceptible to silence and removal. And that's never a reason a card is fundamentally bad, but when you stack that on top of the conditionality, the difficulty of achieving this, the inconsistency, all of that combined makes Wicked Skeleton a really, really bad card, which is sort of a shame because I love the artwork of it. It looks very cool, but also very, very forgotten. So now we're moving into the top 5, starting off with Arcane Golem. Maybe I should say bottom 5, actually, because these are the least played cards. Arcane Golem has about 6,500 plays in the HS Replay dataset over the course of 2018. And that's kind of sad to me a little bit, because I remember the days when Arcane Golem actually saw quite a bit of play. Back when it was a 4/2 charger, and you didn't really care about the downside because you were just looking for that super cheap charge minion to maximize things like OTK combos where you could do a ton of damage with power overwhelmings and faceless manipulators and all kinds of crazy stuff, and more beyond that even. But now Arcane Golem, of course, has this enormous downside bundled in that he used to have, but without that charge upside. So the only reason to play Arcane Golem now is for an overstatted minion on curve on turn 3. But like I said previously with Toothy Chest, 4/4 is just not scary enough in this world of Hearthstone today, and that downside's enormous. We all know how good ramp is, and giving ramp to your opponent is a real nightmare. So that leaves Arcane Golem in this spot where you're benefiting your opponent way too much for very small upside on your side of the field, because you're only getting, maybe 1 extra attack over like a vanilla statted minion, and that's just not worth the trade-off. So this card, not really just forgotten, but one of those cards that actively harms you. And for that reason, I think that's why Arcane Golem never sees the light of day in Hearthstone. Up next at the number 4 spot here, we have Furnace Fire Colossus from Knights of the Frozen Throne, being played less than 6,000 times. And I'll go ahead and spoil this now. This is the last remaining card on this list that's not from RastaCons Rumble, which means it's the lowest ranking card of any card in Hearthstone that had an entire year of opportunity to be played. So in many ways, you could argue this card was more forgotten or more ignored or more disliked than any other card in the entire game, which honestly surprises me a little bit. I don't feel like this card's fundamentally terrible. I've had some fun trying to make it work before. It seems like one of those cards that encourages, experimentation among the community. but apparently not. People just don't ever play this card. You know, I've been going through and trying to think of an explanation for why that might be. I don't really have one. Clearly, discarding things is not usually a good thing in Hearthstone unless you have some sort of synergy or benefit to it, like Warlock has. Not a good Warlock card because Warlock only has one weapon, so it doesn't really make sense there. Other classes typically don't want to discard their weapons, so there are a lot of downsides. It's another card that can actively hurt you, but is it that much worse than every other card in the game? There are so many bad cards that are being played more often, and I don't really know. I mean, it is an epic, so maybe it's a card that nobody ever crafts or bothers to craft. Whereas a lot of bad cards might be commons or rares and get a little bit more experimentation there. It is only good in a couple specific classes that have enough weapons to discard. And when I say good, I mean like experimentable. Obviously, it's still very bad in most cases. So perhaps there's just enough kind of restrictions or limiting factors here. It's an epic. It's only good in weapon classes. It's a high cost card. When you get all of those things combined, it's very, very bad, I guess, is another reason. I guess that means it's just, for whatever reason, one of the most forgotten, most ignored, most easily unplayed cards in Hearthstone, which still a tad surprising, but I guess at least a little bit understandable. So now moving into the top three, all of these are going to be RastaCons Rumble cards that really haven't had a whole lot of time to shine. They've only had about a month of play opportunities, so not surprising that they're ranking at the top, and that might bother some people, like, oh, you're not, giving the cards a chance or whatever. That's irrelevant. We're just looking at the raw data here. I'm not making subjective value statements about the ordering of the cards. This is just what the numbers are. We're talking about the year in total, not trying to, interpret anything else beyond that. So these cards have had less opportunities. They've been played less. At the very least, you can say these cards are the least popular or least experimented with RastaCons Rumble cards so far. All that said, at the number 3 spot here, we have the Booty Bay Bookie. And again, we've got an early game minion with a stat upside that gives a huge downside. It gives a benefit to your opponent. A few of those on this list. You can't just do that in the early game in Hearthstone. 1 or 2 extra stat points is not worth it. Booty Bay Bookie falls right in line there. Giving your opponent a coin is a really, really bad deal to gain 1 extra attack over like a 2-3 or 1 health over a 3-2. There are a lot of other good 2-drop minions in the game, so no surprise here again that this card doesn't see play. I rank this as one of my worst cards in RastaCons Rumble, and I think people properly identified that and aren't willing to screw around with this card yet. Maybe some mill deck eventually will give it a home, but for now, people are definitely ignoring this one. At the number 2 spot here, we have Line Cracker, a card I've actually played a fair bit. I bet I contribute a meaningful percentage of the 5,735 plays for this card because I built a Line Cracker Paladin with a bunch of buff stuff, and Line Cracker I think has been halfway decent in that deck. No, by no means good, but at least fun and exciting and worth it, I think, personally. So a bit shocked here, but keep in mind this is a 7 cost card. Overkill cards in general, I think, have fallen pretty hard in RastaCons Rumble outside of a few, Undasta cases where they're exceptionally good, but most of them just aren't seeing a lot of play. So Linecracker, easily forgotten, high cost card. You kind of have to commit to it if you're putting it into a deck. Otherwise, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So between the high cost, which already limits its ability to be played because it's going to show up as an opportunity in fewer games. You also have to play it when you're ahead a little bit, I think, a card that's really hard to play from behind. So something that would tend to get kind of stuck in your hand. And again, that's going to contribute to it not being played from your hand onto the board. So all of those factors, I guess, it's not likely to be put in a deck. It's an epic. It's hard to play from behind. It's slow. That means it's one of the least played, but not quite the least played card in RastaCons Rumble. And then finally at our number 1 spot, the least played Hearthstone card of 2018. This one surprises me a fair bit. It's the Arena Patron with only 3,221 plays in the entire HS Replay data set. And that's kind of ironic and funny because the Grim Patron, the reference or cousin for this card from Blackrock Mountain way back in the day, was one of those minions you might have seen like millions of instances of because it just kept resummoning itself over and over again with the famous voice line, so on and so forth. I won't dare repeat it here. But despite that reference and despite Arena Patrons connected nature to that card, apparently nobody is playing this one, and maybe it's because they're sick of patrons. Maybe that's part of it. Nobody wants to deal with it. So weirdly enough, the least played RastaCons Rumble card, and also therefore the least played card of 2018, no one is actually putting this from their hand onto the board. And again, in this scenario, I don't really know exactly why Arena Patron is falling short. I mean, clearly it's not a strong card. The overkill is incredibly difficult to activate because one of the problems is, right, most things have more than 3 health. 5 mana is a big commitment. Things particularly post turn 5 often have more than 3 health. So it takes some different pieces to line it all up to get the overkill working. Even then, it's just sitting there, on defense where it dies super easily. The overkill will not activate on defense. So you're committing into this game plan where you can't really proactively or reliably ever get extra patrons. It's kind of the opposite of the old Grim Patron era. And what that means is you've got a card that's just really, really bad. It just sits there and dies and doesn't ever do anything exciting for you. If you could give it Rush, it's a little bit better, and even then, it's still not good enough. There are better options, better alternatives out there. So perhaps people just identified how weak this card is rather quickly and never really found a reason to experiment with it or try it out. And that's why it's been played significantly less than any other card. You'll note there's a pretty big jump there. It was from like 5,000 to 3,000 here for the Arena Patron. This guy is just absolutely miserable, and nobody wants to see patrons ever again, apparently, because this is not being played at all. And there you go. That wraps it up. The 10 least played cards of 2018. Some surprising ones on this list. I mean, at some point, it's kind of arbitrary, right? Like, they're all such small percentages. What made this list or what didn't might be the difference of like one person who's got a pet card. Like, I might have kept Linecracker out of the bottom spot personally, or at least me and all you guys who tried out my Linecracker Paladin deck. So, the actual ordering and the, significance of what's on the list and what's not isn't necessarily all that important, but it is an interesting thing to look at and explore and consider why some cards might be less important or less popular to people than others, even though, the bottom 500 cards of the year were all bad and really didn't see any meaningful play. What made these 10 stand out as the worst? I don't always know, but it's fun to think about. Now, that said, before I go, I do want to quickly show you guys how to see these sorts of stats and find the least played and least popular cards on hsreplayed.net. And you might be wondering why you'd want to see cards that are not played or not popular on hsreplayed.net. Like, what's the point of seeing bad cards? Well, maybe there's not if you're trying to be the best player in the world, but for somebody like me who likes to experiment with fun stuff and try new ideas and new decks, I think finding cards that are forgotten and trying to turn them into something cool or good is a really fun exercise. It can make you a better deck builder and can just be a ton of fun. So clicking the cards panel here at the top of the site is where we're going to start for this. And then we want to see the times played is the data we used for this particular video. You can also look at deck inclusion as well as a pretty good metric. In this case, for least popular cards, they lined up really closely. But specifically, we use times played. Now, you're going to see here the most popular cards over the last patch period, like Animal Companion played more than anything else because of the dominance of Hunter. But we want to go to the bottom, right? So I don't want to look at all these. I want to just, let's, for instance, set this to RastaCons Rumble just to give ourselves an easy filter here. And we can look over the course of the latest patch. That's fine. So now we have just 135 cards. Now, in this case, you're going to need to click the sparse data button down here because some cards that aren't popular, HS Replay just hides them to not bug you. But if you go down here, you'll see, in fact, over the course of the last patch, Arena Patrons still at the bottom. Booty Bay Bookie still down there. Linecracker has gained a spot over the Ice Cream Peddler. The Ice Cream Peddler, if you remember, early in the expansion was being experimented with Shutterwalk Shaman and all kinds of crazy shenanigans, but that was pre the latest patch. We've filtered here to the latest patch, not the entire expansion. So you can see these things are shifting around a little bit just in the last couple weeks. Linecracker, maybe we're the reason it's gaining a little bit of ground, guys. Maybe it's moving on up. Ice Cream Peddler's fallen. Regenerating Thug is still down here, but you can get a feeling somehow Gurubashi Offering is being played significantly more than all these other cards. Who knows why? I think there was some deck out there that try to create a lot of armor or something with it, which is a fun thing to see. But if you filter like that, you can say, okay, like I want to try to make Moshog Announcer work. I want to try to make Rumble Tusk Shaker work because nobody else is playing these cards, and I think that can be a really fun exercise. But this is exactly how you find those sorts of things. You can also look for things that are like interesting, like Blood Troll Sapper has a higher win rate than most cards, probably because it's a win condition of some sort. But that's intriguing. Maybe Griff does a little better than we thought than the rest of these cards because the win rate's a little bit higher than some of these worst ones. And in fact, Linecracker looks better than these other ones too at 44%. But of course, there's confounding data there because the late game card you only play when you're ahead. So all these different things to consider, but that at the very least is how you find this information. It can be a lot of fun to click around and play. And we'll see that Baited Arrow is the most played card of the entire expansion over this patch. That's crazy. Hunters everywhere. So despite all those hunters, I gotta go play some Hearthstone. That said, if you guys have any thoughts, comments, questions on this video, of course, leave those in the comments below. But until then, thank you so very much for watching. And until next time, game on.